Good morning. Pleasure to be here at the second annual Manitoba Sustainable Protein Research Symposium to talk to you about the environmental benefits of nitrogen-fixing legumes. A bit of context on our talk: the production of synthetic fertilizers results in the emissions of CO2, nitrogen addition to soils, regardless of the form, manure, fertilizer, residues, emits N2O, or nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas. And that's a process that's natural, caused by bacteria in soil. Greenhouse gases are warming our climate, causing various issues that are, we think, already starting to occur and going to be more important in the near future. Nitrogen fertilizers are the major input costs for farmers, but more recently, the price of nitrogen fertilizers has almost tripled. So it's even more of an issue in terms of input costs. Canada has committed to reducing greenhouse gases by 40%. And it is also committed to reducing emissions of nitrous oxide by 30% from fertilizer nitrogen use. Also, soybean and legume forages actually produce their own fertilizer. They don't need synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And through the process of what we call biological nitrogen fixation, they take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it via bacteria in their roots to usable nitrogen forms. This is a primary source of nitrogen for the vast majority of the history of human agriculture. An example here is Three Sisters growing of three companion crops: corn, squash, and beans. Pulses and soybean are good sources of protein, and pulses can thrive in semi-arid conditions, which is really good for growing in the environment of the prairies. Now, most of the history of agriculture in the prairies, and it's a recent history, right? It's only over 100 years old. We have what is on the left side of that field, on the top left image. The left side is the Summerfallow field. The right side has been cropped in that year. This is after harvest. And the Summerfallow, the system where the farmer tilled the field and kept it free of weeds once every 3 years, didn't produce a crop on it. And it conserved soil moisture, and it also resulted in mineralization of nitrogen, so nitrogen would build up in the soil for the next crop year. The bottom right is just a farmer with a team of horses to do that controlled tillage. Now, in today's situation, we are at very little Summerfallow. So not that's kind of the category. The highest category here is up to 6%. And what's happened over the past 30 years, pulses and canola have been brought into rotations. They've displaced Summerfallow. And it's because really over the 3 years, you can have increased grain production, you can market more food, produce more protein. Nitrogen use efficiency for the farm system over those years improves, actually, because you have biological nitrogen fixation, basically free nitrogen, right, from the pulses. I'll give you an example here now of the prairies. Now, data that I took from or downloaded and resolved from Stats Canada, and the Summerfallow's in the brown there. We broke a lot of the land on the prairies. Summerfallow increased, and then it started to decline starting around the 1970s. And really, it's been displaced by canola, and more recently by pulse and soybean. And if we look at a situation in Manitoba, it's very similar to that. And I could show you for Saskatchewan and Alberta. Actually, I had them. I took them out of the deck to save some time. And the Manitoba situation, it's really more that the fact that recently it's been soybean that has come in, which is different than Alberta and Saskatchewan, where you have more pea, lentil, chickpea. And we do have some edible beans that have come in Manitoba as well, earlier than the soybean. And so you can see the Summerfallow is just about gone, and that's really the advent of canola, bringing in of pulses and soybean, and also direct seeding and no-till. And a big reason for being able to successfully no-till has been glyphosate. So work done out of the Swift Current Ag Canada Research Lab, looking at carbon content of rotations. This was done 1995 to 2005, 4 rotations, 3 of them with 1 in 3-year fallow, and 1 continuous cropping wheat, oilseed, and pulses. And you can see that wherever there's fallow in the rotation, we have a loss of carbon. And excuse me, Michael, please. And the bottom rotation, continuous cropping, wheat, oilseed, and pulses, is a slight gain of carbon in the top 6 inches of soil. Now, what is it? Is it the no-till, or is it the continuous cropping that includes the pulses and gaining that carbon? Well, work with by Brian McConkey with Ag Canada, looking at 2 direct seeding systems, a low disturbance and a high disturbance, and over different soil zones of the prairies. This is working with long-term sites across the network of Ag Canada stations in the prairies. They resolved that under low disturbance, there was greater carbon sequestered or stored, organic matter buildup in low disturbance than high disturbance direct seeding. That's just really how the seed is placed in the ground. Usually these are disc openers, low disturbance disc openers. These can be more, and high disturbance being hoe openers. So just reducing, we're not talking tillage here. We're just talking about being able to pop the seed in the ground, make a whole a slot for it. That bit of disturbance even makes a difference in terms of carbon buildup in soil. But by far the most impact was the continuous cropping. So that 1 in 3 years, putting a crop in there of canola, in this case, it would be canola or flax, and also sunflower, I think, and pulses was double the high disturbance. So when we think about buildup of carbon in the prairies, well, you know, it's really a success story of continuous cropping and bringing in that diversification and including the pulses. Now, if we were in 1981, you can see, hey, not much of a change in carbon. We kind of reached an equilibrium. We lost a lot of organic matter and soon after the cultivation, and it came in equilibrium. But then in 2011, it's increased over across the prairies in green there. And that is a result of the lack of summer fallow and the direct seeding and the diversification of our cropping systems with canola and pulses. Now let's look at another benefit of legumes, and that is their synthesis of nitrogen biologically. This is work synthesized by a group of Ag Canada researchers, this out of Lethbridge Research Station, and looking at nitrogen uptake by these different legumes. The overall winner tends to be field pea, and then soybean, alfalfa, and then looking at and fab is in there as well, and looking at how much of the nitrogen they actually produce themselves via bacteria. And you can see that we have alfalfa winning out, faba, pretty high values here. You know, like the slow dog is edible beans, only 40%. So we have to add some nitrogen fertilizer with edible beans. But with the others, we can usually forego most nitrogen, if not at all. All of it, I mean, don't have to put any on. And the researchers then took it and estimated nitrogen uptake from fixation for each of these crops. So the nitrogen that they produce themselves being these amounts, and then upscaling that for the country. And this is gigagrams of nitrogen per year, or metric tons, not metric tons, megatons of nitrogen per year. Look at alfalfa, just tremendous acreage of alfalfa. And it's just, that's a lot of nitrogen synthesized that in effect doesn't have to be synthesized in a factory. Because when we synthesize in a factory, we have the emissions of CO2 because natural gas is used, almost 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of ammonia that is produced in a fertilizer plant. So that nitrogen is spared from producing CO2 or having to make CO2 by having the legumes. It's definitely a great service. Now let's turn gears here and now let's talk about greenhouse gases and legumes. Long-term research sites started in fall of 2005, still going on now. This is a snippet of data from that site. We have 2 rotations I'm showing you here, one in blue and one in red. The one in red includes a cycle of 4 years of alfalfa for forage. We can see that anytime this was corn or spring wheat or rapeseed, and this is industrial oil, rapeseed, barley, spring wheat, we have these yellow stars. These are, and the F stands for when we applied fertilizer, and you can see the spike of N2O emissions. This is N2O on the y-axis here. You see these spikes because often after fertilizer application in the spring with planting, we get some rain, and that's when we get the N2O because the bacteria are producing the N2O emissions. The rest of the year, not too much, except for sometimes after these T's, which is the thaw in April, we get some N2O emissions as well. Look what happens when we do the nitrogen fixing grain legumes. Here's faba bean, no big spike. We split the study into 2, the alfalfa in red, no spike, no red spike here. We didn't add any fertilizer. Next year, no red spike, no red spike, and no red spike. Then we put them both back into corn, or not back into corn, but in corn, and we get red and blue spikes. So, you know, it's magic. It's the plant. That's the reason, and the lack of putting synthetic fertilizer. Even though the alfalfa, you know, we were taking at least 2 cuts with the alfalfa a year, so it was very productive. And so, but no, and 2O emissions despite nitrogen fixation there. And when we have soybean, and this last year that I'm showing you here anyway, no big spike. This is little spikes here, I think, are coming from the corn residue emitting some N2O. Now this is at the Carmen Research Station with a grad student, Mick Renzika, and looking at N2O emissions from soybean in black round circles, and then unfertilized wheat in triangular black. You can see they behave very similarly. This is in 2005. Fertilized spring wheat, nitrogen spikes. We can see much greater N2O emission because of that fertilizer emission. In 2017, we did the same thing over again. You can still see with the spring wheat fertilized, more emissions, and where we have the unfertilized wheat and soybean very low and pretty much the same, except for this one date here after a big rainfall, but there's lots of variability. Really, from this data, no difference in unfertilized wheat and soybean in terms of their N2O emissions, despite the soybean being very productive and producing lots of nitrogen, whereas the unfertilized nitrogen wheat was really puny and didn't do much. So it's pretty amazing that nitrogen just doesn't lead to much N2O. And here I'm summarizing feels like a career's worth of work, where looking at the studies done by the IRC program, and by far the number one beneficial practice that we've looked at is growing a nitrogen fixing legume. 61% reduction in N2O emissions from a whole field basis. 61. By far, the only other practice that seems to come close is split N application, where we put fertilizer on at planting and we put more in early growing season. Number one practice farmer can do is grow nitrogen fixing legumes to reduce N2O emissions. Now, let's go back to that nitrogen budget of Canada and those legumes, nitrogen fixing legumes, and see how much emissions would have come from if we had to actually manufacture that nitrogen that those legumes produced. It add up to about 2 megatons of CO2 equivalents. And if we had added that nitrogen as a fertilizer, it would have released 4.14 megatons of CO2. These are estimates that I modeled. And together, that makes over 6 megatons. That's 12.3% of the emissions from all of agriculture in 2016. So you can see by using legumes currently, we're actually producing less N2O emissions than if we had to rely solely on nitrogen fertilizers. The question then becomes, hey, can we increase the acreage of nitrogen fixing legumes to reduce the emissions even further? Well, let's look at the Manitoba situation for major field crops, where I did a modeling exercise, taking data's publicly available data, and then taking a national inventory report for estimation of greenhouse gases from soil. And for major field crops, cereals, canola, soybean, and green corn. Here's the acreages of those crops. Cereals declining, canola increasing, kind of stabilizing though in Manitoba. Soybean was going nuts, and in 2017, kind of maybe it's stabilizing now, and we're not sure. We can't really say what's stabilizing in our current agro environment. Corn just kind of petering, steady increase. I took that, and then with nitrogen use from crop insurance, and then regressed and came up with the rate of increase of nitrogen. There seems to be quite a sharp difference since 2006, 2007 for an increase. And you can see it's quite a substantial increase every year in terms of nitrogen rates. And so now we have the acreage, we know the nitrogen rates. We can estimate the N2O emissions based on the National Inventory Reporting Tier 2 IPCC protocol that Canada uses. And here's the N2O emissions. So we had a somewhat of a slow rise, and then we have the sharp rise that's occurring post 2017. Guess what happened after 2017? You guessed it, soybean went down, right? Now the cereals were declining, kind of popped back up again. Canola increasing. Remember, it's stabilized the acreages, but the rates are going up, and therefore the N2O emissions are going up. Okay, so this is the current situation from these major field crops. Look at the soybean, really not much N2O emitted. And if there was no soybean today, the emissions would be much more. It'd be climbing steadily up. So what I did was I partitioned soybean acreage to cereals and canola, and just made that assumption. And it would jack up the emissions by 15%. from what they are now. So that's the benefit of soybean to Manitoba in terms of its N2O reduction. It's about 15%. That's pretty fantastic. What happens in the future? I had done some preliminary work on this a few years ago, and I worked up to 20, 30 different scenarios. And I gave up those scenarios because there's just too much going on. You can see in front of you what's going on here, that we just don't know where things are going to be heading in terms of our commodities, our acreages, and what farmers, their decisions and so forth to do. However, I made a simple assumption here. Let's say soybean does go back up to levels in 2017. That's about a million hectares. And that would result in a decrease. So that's the point here. I'm just assuming that was in 2030. And that would result then in a 7% drop in N2O emissions from currently. Now that's taking into account an increase in canola and corn and cereal nitrogen rates. Right? You got to remember that those keep going up. And so that is pretty impressive. So we have the 12% contribution currently, and we could have even more if we had the ability to increase the soybean acreage. Now, so far, I'm mainly talking about greenhouse gas emissions from manufacturing and from soil, from fertilizer added to soil. There's also emissions from residues, and legume residues have, per concentration of material, they have more nitrogen in them. We refer to it as, we look at an indicator of carbon nitrogen ratio, and often they're lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, 12, 15, 16, compared to much higher, 25, 30, 35 for residues of our non-legume crop. So the question was, well, do they produce more N2O per unit of nitrogen being added with the legume residues? So we embarked on looking at that. And here we did a microplot study at Carmen, make that a microcosm, not a microcosm, I guess you call it microcosm. They're pretty small. You can see these round chambers in here, and we have sections, quadrats in here. We labeled the soil with 15 nitrogen, urea, very low amounts, and then the plants could take a bit of that, and we had sensitive mass specs that can analyze the N2O emissions and N15 and the residue and so forth, and in the soil. And we could track now the N2O that's emitted that would have come from the previous year's residue. So we had labeled wheat, we had labeled soybean, and then the following year in a wheat crop, we can track how much N2O came from the residue from the previous year. So that's what we did, and we can see that the contribution of soybean and wheat residues using this 15N method was pretty much the same. Really wasn't affected. And however, in this second year that we followed that, we did see an effect early on, and it was during spring thaw. It wasn't after fertilizer application to the wheat. That's what was here. Nothing was too dry, but it was in spring thaw. That's when we have denitrification occurring by bacteria because of the wet conditions. So something interesting is going on there. It's not N2O emissions from our normal means of nitrification during the growing season of nitrogen by bacteria, but rather it's that spring thaw emission that we often do see when we have high nitrate levels in wet soils. So what did we make from that? Well, the bottom line is statistically, we couldn't see a difference in terms of the proportion of nitrogen in those residues, either being the soybean or the wheat, that came off as N2O. Okay, it's just 1 year was not much happening at all. The second year of the unit, it was really that spring thaw emissions that had lots of moisture to drive higher for both the residues, the soybean and the wheat. And interestingly, remarkably, at least that year of high emissions is pretty similar to what Canada uses to estimate N2O from residues. And that dry year we emitted a lot less. So good news is they're not aggravating N2O emissions from per unit of nitrogen added. Now, what we don't know exactly is how much of the residue nitrogen is being added. So we have to do some more detailed studies with residue nitrogen from soybean that's above and below ground, and how much actual nitrogen they're adding, and how does that compare to wheat and canola, for example. That's not all roses. There's some caveats here. Now, organic production, crop production, reliance on plow down of legume green manures, in this case alfalfa, at Martinense's long-term Glen Lee study. 2014, Megan Westphal, we plowed in alfalfa in late summer. It was fairly dry, nothing happened to it. And we saw a little bit of nitrate pop up, but not much. But in 2015, did it again and plowed on the alfalfa, but it was really wet in the fall. And that alfalfa decomposed and mineralized and even nitrified, produced nitrate in the fall, and even in the spring thaw here in the next spring, high levels of nitrate, and that had massive implications for N2O. So that plow downs here was dry, no emissions of N2O in the fall or even the next spring. It was just too dry. So the alfalfa was fantastic. The organic system, fantastic. Low N2O emissions compared to fertilized wheat. But in 1 year with a wet fall, we have high emissions of N2O in the spring during that thaw period. So it's twice here in this session that we're talking about this emissions from spring thaw, which can be important. Obviously, it's very important in this organic system. So we're working on this. Martin is with a organic cluster, science cluster, to see how we can reduce these emissions on wet conditions. All right, so where do we go from here? Few things. Well, our no-till, no Summerfallow cropping system still gaining carbon? This is a big question for our no-till systems. Very important for farmers that want to work on carbon credit systems. Is there more residue nitrogen being added with soybean compared to canola and wheat? Soybean doesn't have a lot of residue, but there's higher concentration of nitrogen in the residue. So we need to work that out to get a better picture on emissions potentially from that side of things. Refine the modeling estimates that I showed you here based on more crops, practices such as for fertilizer management practice and for different locations within Manitoba, because emissions can vary. And then tweak scenarios of cropping acreages. The impact of decline in tame hay acreage, if you noticed in black, I showed you this is alfalfa and alfalfa grass for livestock production. What's the impact there? Is it going to have impact on organic carbon loss, but also if it's replaced with fertilized crops, more N2O. Need to solve this N2O issue with plow downs and organic production. And we need to minimize weather extremes and adapt to climate changing climate to secure our legume acreages, for example, with soybean, to make it very consistent that soybean can pay off year after year. All right, lots of people to thank. I can't go through everyone, but thanks, Aaron and Jim, for the invitation to speak here. I look forward to joining in on the panel. I look forward to taking any questions that you may have as well. That you want to send me by email. All right. All right, take care. Bye now.